Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Clipping called Splendor and Misery. There will be two sets of people who will end up seeing this review. The first set, those of you who know what Clipping is, the experimental rap trio signed to Sub Pop, who in 2014 dropped their self-titled debut album, which remains one of the best records of that year and featuring some of their best ever songs. A trio known in the underground for some explosively distorted music, twisted samples, and a sheer mind-bending wordplay of Daveed Diggs. I know why all of you are here. You know what Clipping is and the meticulous yet delirious intensity with which they approach their work. Now, their newest concept album experiment makes all too much sense for an act that's got a knack for storytelling, but let's get brutally honest. You're not the set of people that I'm worried about. You're fine. I'm talking about you. Yes, you, right there, the people who saw Hamilton, or more likely just got the soundtrack, and were just entranced by Daveed Diggs' insane skill as a rapper, which won him a Grammy and a Tony earlier this year. From there, you might have heard that this guy had a group, and they were dropping an album this year, and you were kind of curious to hear more. Hell, maybe it would sound a little bit like Hamilton. So let me disabuse you all of some notions. This will not sound like Hamilton. I'm sorry, folks. The theater that Daveed Diggs was involved in before Hamilton was even more experimental. The stuff that would never land on Broadway in a million years. And Clipping's even further away from that in production and in content. And this album looked to be pushing into weirder directions than that. Heralded as a hip-hop space opera, which I hoped was a lot more Deltron 3030 than Shabazz Palaces or Logic, but we're getting off topic here. This is an album that was looking to push its high concept to the absolute limit. Of course, you would kind of expect that coming from a group where one member has a PhD with a dissertation on experimental music inspired by Tim Hecker and Death Grips, but if all you know going in is that, well, Daveed Diggs was in Hamilton, you might run screaming for the hills before giving this album any sort of fair consideration. And hey, you'd be in fair company. There are way too many critics who have already dismissed this album rather than just admit that they don't get it. So if you're expecting something accessible or easier to take in, even by Hamilton standards, this is your chance to just clear off now. I'm not going to judge you that hard. Friendly warning, it's going deep from here. So are they gone? Good, let's dig into Splendor and Misery. Does it live up to my high expectations? Well, okay, this review is going to be a little bit weird for me because even after a lot of listens through this album, I'm not even completely sure that I get it because it is one hell of an experience. And one of the big reasons for that is I don't really have that many direct comparison points for this album. This record is so far divorced even from what Clipping has previously released that it's really hard to add any sort of context, especially when you consider the incredibly broad pool of sci-fi references that this album draws upon. And I'll be blunt, there's a part of me that thinks this album might be a little bit too wrapped up in its own clever impenetrability for its own damn good, because there are some ideas that only barely hold together, especially when it comes to some of the production. And yet, for me at least, it works. A sort of ambitious leap that is definitely not as accessible as Mid-City or the self-titled album, with the sort of defiantly unique aesthetic that's grounded in enough humanity to have some real emotive power. And while it definitely demands a lot of attention to wedge yourself into the headspace and then give it an additional dozen listens afterwards, honestly, I think it's worth it because this is a really great album. But as such, there is no easy way to describe this record in my conventional style, so let me start off with the narrative as it is. There appears to be far in the future, and there's a revolt on a slave ship in the middle of deep space. Everybody dies except for one escaped slave, who barely has enough context to understand the ship and its systems that are so far beyond his control, but now he's alone and he must decide where to go in the vast universe. Fully aware without proper navigation, he may never encounter another soul ever again. Oh, and the majority of the songs in this album are from the perspective of the ship's computer, which seems to have an odd fascination with this escaped slave and his history that walks the weird balance between clinical and irrational, the sort of love that only a machine could really produce and contextualize. And as such, the instrumentation falls into two main categories. Easily some of the most sterile, airless beats and glitch that Clipping has ever used, with touches of distorted synth and theremin because it's a space opera. Of course there's gonna be a theremin, and yet opposite it, the sort of bluesy melodies that go back beyond the creation of the genre to the slave songs of the 1800s. It's a fusion of overlapping vocal melodies and tunes that are older than the past century of music, and then combined with the interlocking mechanical sparks that seem desolate even for hard sci-fi and even for this particular brand of hip-hop. And make no mistake, For the first half dozen listens I went through this album, the context, the fusion here is jarring. I get the Afrofuturist context for the juxtaposition and the stark historical parallels, but on a sonic level, it sounds bizarre when you have these rich, soulful tones spilling from speakers warped by static and fuzz, glitch that oddly seems a far stronger fit for Dobby Diggs' relentless flow, and yet I'd argue here he's more melodic and theatrical on this album than he has ever been. Clearly some parts of Hamilton are coming through, leaping across nearly a dozen different interweaving flows with the sort of writing that's so tightly written that it almost feels composed by computer. And of course, that kind of makes sense given how most of these lines are supposedly being delivered by a computer. But that being said, these are easily some of the most sparse and barren soundscapes that he's ever had to work with. And there's a part of me that wishes these songs could have had a little bit more texture and melody to add a little bit more here. The only tunes we get are on songs like All Black, this thin squeal of glitch, a burbling chiptune, and a barren atmosphere that carries just enough of tone to elevate the tension here. And then there's Wake Up, and it takes those tinny bubbles and plays them off Doppler shards of cymbal, klaxons, and a rumbling gallop of rounded bass. Songs like True Believer are a little bit more established, with ratcheting clangs, empty radio feedback, and a darker tone near the very back, where Break the Glass sounds like the rending of airlocks against low groans that sound like something out of a Hans Zimmer score. Then there's Baby Don't Sleep, which takes these whirring gallops and hisses of static and fuses them to a beat that for a hook adds in a single blurred over ambient tone. And I have to wonder if the song would stick a little bit more in the brain, have a little bit more of a hook if there was just more to it. Now take for instance Air 'Em Out, which takes these tiny thin little fragments of synth against deeper echoes, mechanical whirs, and a stutter of percussion. It almost sounds like a trap anthem that's going to be written 1,000 years in the future, and as such, it's easily one of the most catchy songs on the album. There is a real hook there. And then there's the closer, A Better Place, which takes an incredibly thin organ and almost reminds me of something you'd hear at a hockey rink, and then adds in layers of deeper bass and thicker textures that builds this oddly triumphant moment. Of course, the most powerful song on this album is Story 5, which doesn't even need any instrumentation. It's one of the most gorgeous and heartbreaking a cappella tunes I've heard all year. I'm not sure if it matches Story 2 just yet, but it reinforces my belief that if Clipping ever made a stories compilation, it would probably be the best thing they've ever done, because this song really is something special. But you know what? That's just the sound of this album. Now we have to get into some of the content. And let me start by putting aside some of the technical gimmicks that Clipping uses here in their narrative. As much as I can appreciate that Interlude 2 Numbers contains a code that you can later crack with a keyword from Air 'Em Out that looks to be a reference to previous Clipping albums, those are really just Easter eggs. They're cute, I appreciate the references, but they also feel kind of perfunctory on an album that is so tightly streamlined that they can feel just a little bit out of place, a little indulgent. Granted, that streamlining might be part of the larger problem. While I appreciate that there's not an inch of fat on this album, for a space opera, it is ridiculously tight. It also completely eschews the sense of grandeur and scope you would expect that normally come out of this sort of sci-fi. Even in some of the most cold and clinical space operas like 2001: A Space Odyssey, even though that's not really space opera, or conversely, the progressive metal album 01011-001 by Arion, you normally get some grander swell and scope, but Splendor and Misery doesn't really bother with it except at the very end, and yes, I'll come back to that. And yeah, that kind of makes sense for an album from the perspective of an observing computer, with only 2 interludes spoken by our main protagonist down below. But that's another narrative element that I would kind of question, because it further distances us from that human element, and that's where the strongest pathos on this album comes from. We get a lot of technological detail of what has happened and is happening to our main character, but very little of his internal response, which, yeah, on some level does fit the high concept thematic narrative. To be blunt, Clipping isn't being subtle about the political undertones and the symbolic parallels between the escaped slave and modern black society, touching on adherence to personal rituals to stay sane in a cold, uncaring universe, at the mercy of systems that they can't control but still blame themselves for their condition, and a society around them that not only can't look away but seems kind of enamored with that culture. But as the album progresses, that computer seems to want greater contact with that raw humanity that cuts through, urges them to break through the emergency glass, interact more deeply, and this is where Story 5 comes in. It's a story of a woman named Grace who faced a dark past with relentless optimism, and yet when confronted with the possibility that everything she could have built could come crashing down, she just smile and keep going. only to get killed in a random accident. And this tragedy is the linchpin, the anchor point of this album. In spite of everything that she had done, what was it all worth when the uncaring universe just ends her almost by accident? And Baby Don't Sleep only further emphasizes this. What use is a god to a non-believer in the vastness of space, all the further divorce from society at large? But staying in that system with no control, that's surrendering its own right. And this is where we hit the thematic crux point of this album. When confronted with the emptiness and the futility of his own existence and the vastness that he can't possibly contextualize or understand, the protagonist, he doesn't collapse into insanity like so many Lovecraftian heroes, but feels a tremendous force of liberation. When you recognize that you're not the center of the universe, the only things that matter are what you choose to make matter. Or to put it another way, the meaning of life is to give life meaning. And maybe that's why the ending of this record ends with the swell of organ, the chorus seeking to find a better place to be someone, and a well-placed Star Trek reference that I won't spoil, but's kind of magical in its own way. It comes together with that humanist thrill that I always loved about the original series in Star Trek. But to put it another way, while there are thematic parallels between Splendor and Misery to other works of science fiction, both in music and otherwise, the execution of this album is something damn near unique in hip-hop's history, with a sonic template blending in the distant past and future, and probably one of the few rappers with the technical skill to marry the jargon with the soulful humanity you need to pull this off, plus the sort of brilliant sci-fi Afrofuturist allegory that feels defiantly gritty and yet unique. I guarantee you won't hear an album like this in the near future with this sort of ambition. So yeah, 2 hip-hop albums in a row, just like De La Soul's last record. Clipping's getting an 8 out of 10 and a high recommendation. I will not say this is accessible or even better than their self-titled release. I'm still kind of on the fence there. That song really does have some standout tracks I'm not sure this record has. I understand if the target audience for this is even painfully narrow, but for those of you who are in that target demographic, like, say, me, this really is something special. And Clipping, though I doubt that you're watching this, gentlemen, live long and prosper. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here. I can imagine this review might be a little bit polarizing because, again, I've seen a lot of reviews where people just don't seem to get or appreciate this album because there's a lot of intricate details in this. You will not get this album if you don't give it like 6 or 7 listens. There's a lot to really take in. But I think for those of you who are more sci-fi fans and hip-hop fans as well, give it some time, it will really click. It is something really special, I can say that for sure. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. I got a busy schedule over the next couple days, and I'm going to lose the entire next weekend. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.